Welcome to the Magnificast, a podcast about Christianity and leftist politics. I'm your co-host, Dean Detloff.
And I'm your other co-host, Matt Vernico.
We're still the same co-hosts as ever, and we've been away for a couple weeks. I've been traveling. Matt's been doing more interesting things, climbing mountains, posting pictures. That's been great. I've been running around, but now I'm back home, and that feels pretty good. Matt, a lot I feel like has happened in the last 2 weeks. It's hard to even know what to talk about on this podcast anymore.
It does. It feels very hard to know what to talk about, given how fast things happen. You've got an ongoing genocide in Gaza. You've got all kinds of political turmoil in the U.S. You've got I wrote a whole episode for our podcast about the protests in L.A. And that's just that's never gonna see the light of day because too much is going on because now the United States is at war with Iran and bombing them. So that sucks. It sucks that a war got in the way of talking about protests, but here we are.
Here we are, and with any luck, the war will allow us to talk about more protests. Who knows? But until that happens, we're talking about probably the most useless thing that we could possibly talk about, but something that I feel well prepared to ramble on about for about an hour in a way that may or may not be useful. Matt and I feel like whenever we're like, we have to do an episode, we haven't done one in a while, we don't have time to think about it, what should we do? We just think back to some extremely weird thing that we learned in graduate school and then kind of ask ourselves whether or not that thing is important. And I feel like one reliable person for revisiting who like may or may not be important, but is at least very fun is Paul Virilio. A weird French guy who makes an appearance on this podcast probably at least once a year, I'd say. And I guess this is the time. Whenever there's some kind of war machine going off in the world, it just makes sense to go back to him. So, I mean, we could talk about so many things. We could talk about, as you said, the protests in LA. We could talk about the G7. That's where I was last week. We could talk about a bunch of stuff. But instead, we're going to use this as an excuse to talk about French philosophy. A true postgraduate school kind of thing to do.
Yeah, for sure. It's very funny that you say that it's something that we can talk about in sort of an unthinking way. Like we know this so well that I don't even have to think about this, but I have actually spent like several hours today.
Not like that.
Okay. I spent several hours today reading this Paul Virilio book, and I'm just like, I can't stop reading it because it's just like so weird. But okay, all that aside, like it's seemingly stupid to bring up a weird French guy in the midst of like ongoing sort of like political and like real warfare on the ground and stuff. But I think that something that I find really compelling about Paul Virilio is that he's a theorist of war. He's a philosopher of war. He's always thinking about the ways that like our society is militarized through and through, and there's like, there are ways to deal with that, but they're very difficult ways. And the thing that I find compelling about him, though, is that he thinks that there's a real politics and pacifism, but not in the kind of, I don't know, morally uptight types of pacifism you find in Christianity a lot of times. So anyways, I think that that's the really exciting thing about Paul Virilio is that there is like a type of nonviolence that is an ethic that follows along his sort of philosophizing, theorizing, but it's like extremely different than you'd get from so many other people.
Yeah, he is a professional weirdo, and that's what I love about him. And when I say we could talk about him forever, it is definitely not because he's someone you can know inside and out. It's actually the opposite. It's someone that you could never, even if you devoted your entire life to understanding him, never ever could you understand him. In part by design. I was telling Matt, there is a quote that I am certain is real, but I couldn't tell you where it's from. But somewhere when I was trying to learn Virilio, I read it, where an interviewer is asking him, like, why do you write like an insane person, basically? Why is your writing so hard to read? And his reply is basically like, oh yeah, I do that on purpose to like slow you down. I want to slow down the reader and, tie him into knots and kind of resist the acceleration of society. And like, I think that's a cool thing for a philosopher to say. It is an extremely annoying thing to actually have to read, but it's annoying in the best possible way. Just like an endless series of puzzles that may or may not have an answer. Basically just a vibes-based kind of textual world that you get invited into. And I will say that by the time I get out of reading a Virilio book, I can't say that I understand Virilio better, but I do feel like I kind of like get the world in a different way.
Yeah.
And that's That's pretty good.
Yeah, I think that's about right. He has a vibes based philosopher, and there's nothing systematic about it. Even like from book to book, sometimes his definitions and ideas like shift slightly. Some like an idea that he had parsed out really specifically in one book is it becomes something sort of adjacent in the next book, which is fine. But you just have to kind of like be committed to playing in the space with him, and that's
Hmm.
sometimes a hard commitment. So, anyways, you don't have to read them. You don't have to read them yourself. We're just going to talk about Paul Virilio on this episode, and with regards to war and to the militarization of society and to pacifism. But I guess before we do that, let's talk about like maybe the situation at hand and the ideas through which we are kind of like coming to Paul Virilio because of. Okay, you already know this, I'm sure, because you're listening to our podcast, and I'm like, if this is your first stop for news, that would be wild. But there is like a brand new war situation between the United States, Israel on one hand, and then Iran on the other. You probably know that like nearly 10 years ago, the United States and its allies had a nuclear deal with Iran that traded a promise to stop plans for nuclear enrichment in exchange for unlocking assets withheld through sanctions. That was a deal that was brokered by Barack Obama. I'm sorry, Barack Hussein Obama. Let me get his full name right. Um, and like that was a pretty big diplomatic victory. Uh, but since then, that deal has kind of been destroyed. Not kind of been; it has been destroyed. That's like one of the things that Trump did in his first term. He pulled out the deal, putting the sanctions back on Iran, and like that's the end of the story. Um, this is some important background because there's a lot of anxiety in the United States right now. That's I feel like in bad faith. There's a lot of anxiety in the United States about Iran's, capacity for nuclear weapons and what they're going to do, and why a military intervention is necessary. But I guess it's like such a weird thing to think about because there was a treaty in place, and then even after that treaty, there were more negotiations that were like starting back up between the United States and Iran in Rome at the end of May. But that was all interrupted after Israel attacked Iran in June, and then the United States followed shortly after. So we have this weird situation. It's not weird. It's just politics, I guess. It's just fascism on a global stage. But we have the situation where like there was sort of like a holding pattern. There was sort of a negotiation where things were sort of settled with regards to nuclear weapons in Iran and the United States, but then it was sort of blown up by Donald Trump. And then it was like, kind of getting back on track, but then it was blown up again. So here we are in sort of a state, again, of perpetual war, which is not what we want to see. So, anyways, when it comes to like thinking about war and like what it war is such a hard idea, as Paul Virilio will end up telling us here in a minute. But when it comes to thinking about war, Paul Virilio is a really helpful person to kind of go along with because he sort of explodes the ideas that like war is a sort of discrete thing that has a beginning and an end. Instead, he thinks that there's this other thing going on that's called pure war, which is a complicated term, but one that he's also borrowing from Clausewitz, another sort of like philosopher of war, but in a different a different vein altogether. But it's basically this idea that our society is overwhelmingly militarized, whereas someone like Marx will tell you that like the working class is the motor of history or something. Paul Virilio would probably say something like, well, the military is the is the motor of history. It's militarization that leads society in particular directions, and because of that, we all sort of have this like part to play within a militarized society, whether we like it or not. In some ways, all of our lives are entangled with the whole idea of war. Um, so, anyways, I think it's kind of a helpful, it's a helpful theoretical lens to sort of bring to the situation because it does kind of like help us recognize the ways that not only is like this sort of explosion of war that's happening now, um, not sort of just like a political episode, but it's sort of an ongoing conflict not just because of United States imperialism, but just because of the way that like Western society works.
Yeah. Yeah, and I mean, the kind of thing you pointed out about how the military logic kind of draws society along, I think is something I've always found really challenging and fascinating about Virilio, especially in conversations on the left. For Marxism, history is the drama of class struggle. These classes, economic classes, kind of entangled in their contradictions, and in a true kind of Hegelian way, eventually they explode. Right, you have a revolution. Virilio is not like that. For him, instead, he has a line in Speed and Politics, a big book that he wrote, where he says history progresses at the speed of its weapon systems. And he has this whole kind of ontology where like there's a dialectic of speed and sight and violence that kind of pushes society along in this complicated way, but there's not really like a natural revolutionary alternative to it, as though like at some point the speeds are just too fast or the violence is just too much. And that's actually the most troubling thing about Virilio, is that if you want to get out of it, you really got to eject on purpose in a big way. And what it means to do that, or whether or not it's even possible, is like a question that Virilio sort of often refuses to answer in a very unsettling way.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that you could like look at that and say, well, Virilio is not useful, or compared to Marx, he doesn't give you as much to do politically, and to an extent that is like kind of true. But I also think Virilio, for people on the left, can function by pointing out some things that really get lost, especially in kind of Marxist conversations about the pernicious logic of war and violence. Marxism obviously has a long history of uh, getting involved in violence, maybe for better and worse, and also a complicated history with war and how to deal with war and what war does to your revolutionary dream, and how it kind of conscripts the revolution into these other goals that aren't necessarily about equality, but maybe end up in surveillance or unnecessary violence. And I think Virilio is like trying to articulate what's the logic underneath all that, that kind of takes the freedom movements that we want away from us, or at least poses like a danger, kind of haunts them. And obviously that piece is maybe not as directly relevant for like analyzing Iran, or analyzing the United States war machine, but I think it's like maybe helpful to keep in mind when we're thinking about Virilio, to be like he's trying to parse something out, so that if we really did want to live in a world without war and violence, in addition to like without labor exploitation, then we would have to take the time to figure out what war actually does to us and how it kind of breaks our brains in really specific ways.
All of that is right, what you're saying. One more important piece of kind of setting the table here. I don't know if I like the metaphor of setting the table. Like I'm gonna eat this old French man. But one more piece that is important to get out here before we kind of move on. Paul Virilio is Christian. That's maybe the connection to the podcast. Not only is he a weird French philosopher that we like, but he's Catholic and he's Christian, and that particular worldview and perspective is like integral to his philosophy. It is, I think, Paul Virilio is, I think, some of like the history that he's bringing to the table is fine and understandable, but regardless of religion. But his particular approach and like kind of thought about ethics in the world is uniquely Christian, and I don't think you can really understand that part of him without understanding that he is a real life person of faith. So anyways, a good addendum. Can't forget that this podcast is about Christianity and leftist politics, and Paul Virilio is also about Christianity and, I don't know, politics. Maybe not leftist ones, but not leftist ones either.
Yeah, in fact, one point in Virilio's favor. So there's two famous Christian French anarchists. There are more than that, but basically two: Jacques Ellul and Paul Virilio.
Yeah.
Jacques Ellul, he's the Calvinist one. Paul Virilio, he's the Catholic one. They both hate technology for different reasons. But Jacques Ellul, he went to Guy Debord, the situationist anarchist weird guy, and he was like, "Can I join your crew? You guys seem really cool." And Debord went back and he had a conversation with the situationists, and they were like, "Sorry, man, you're a Christian. You can't be part of it." But DeBoer and Virilio were like pretty good friends and could hang out and like do stuff together. And I feel like that is, kind of an interesting thing as well. There's a Virilio's Christianity sort of opens him up in a different way. Like he's not very defensive about it. It's more like his Christianity is a means of encountering the world in a deeper sort of way, in a way that Ilul's Christianity is always a bit of a fortress against the world in a weird way.
Right. Yeah.
But Virilio is one of those weird Christians that even people like Deleuze and Guattari are like willing to cite and not complain about. So he earned his credibility to hang with all the other weird French people in ways that other Christians had a harder time doing.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, all of those people you were just mentioning, Debord, Deleuze, Foucault, I don't know, all staunch atheists, but they can let Paul Virilio hang out with them. I guess that's cool. He must be okay.
Yeah. All right. So we've talked about Virilio a lot of times on the show in the past, and there's a lot of different concepts that he comes up with. And I think that's one thing you could understand Virilio doing. He's trying to create different conceptual tools that we can use to kind of pull apart the world that we encounter. And like you said, Matt, sometimes those concepts are inconsistent or they work differently in different books. But I think that's kind of the strength of Aurelio in a weird way, that he's not trying to build a systematic philosophy. He's trying to kind of like provide language for different intuitions. And then within the context of a particular analysis, he wants to see what that language does. What does it open up? How does it deepen that intuition or clarify it in some way? And I mean, he's a very like intuitive kind of thinker, not a systematician at all. But he has this concept that he doesn't make up, but that he sort of riffs on and puts to different use, called pure war. And it is maybe most simply, we'll get into what he says about it later on, but most simply it comes from this guy named Clausewitz, who's a pretty like standard theorist of war, writing in the 19th century. And at its most simple, it means like pure war is kind of two armies totally devoted to the destruction of each other in this pretty standard like militarized way, but in a way that kind of pulls society into that effort. It's a pure war. It's these two militaries, they're fighting each other. And Virilio has a lot to say about that. But he also has a lot to say about what he calls impure war, which is kind of when the logic of war gets like reflexively turned back on the citizens in a society. And they're kind of like two sides of the same coin. They kind of come together. And the examples he might give of something like impure war would be when he was writing, especially during the Bush administration, things like the Patriot Act, or, trying to understand enemies that might not be a particular like an equal and opposite army, but instead are people like terrorists or ideological opponents, people who could be anyone who could use any kind of weapon. And so all of a sudden, everybody is kind of a potential enemy. It's a kind of like, someone like Jacques Derrida, to pull in another weird French philosopher, would say it's sort of like an autoimmune response of society. Like the problem, the germs are inside, not outside. And so you end up like attacking yourself, surveilling yourself. And I think what's really interesting about pure war and impure war is it does help us start to parse out the Trump administration and some of the contradictions that are being shown in it right now. And maybe I'll just get that piece on the table, and then we can keep making it more complicated.
Sure.
With Virilio himself. Yeah. So, the Trump apparatus, you could say, which includes Donald Trump, but also lots of other people around him, it has always been characterized by contradictions. It frustrates a lot of conservatives because it's ideologically flexible. Trump is unpredictable. He says one thing one day, he does something else the next day. Doesn't really matter. You can't like pull a through line. But the second Trump administration seems like an even more complicated like pastiche of right-wing anxieties. There's just like more wild stuff in the mix. It's more accelerated. It's moving faster, harder against people, and so on. And Virilio's analysis of war, it doesn't really like put all that weird stuff into one neat package, but it does help us understand some of those ideologies that are stacked on top of each other and competing within that administration. So, for example, Trump campaigned on being the peace candidate in his messaging, and he's still talking about being, he needs the Nobel Peace Prize or whatever, but he's increasingly militant. And that kind of happened in the first term. People might forget Trump ordered a missile strike on, I forget, Syria, Iran, who knows anymore, in like 2017. But the attack on Iran currently is an endorsement of Israel's ongoing military campaign in a way that's more intense and threatening. And that, if you're a particular kind of conservative, is good news. If you're like a right wing Bush era military hawk, you're like, yeah, Iran, they're a rogue, parasite, pariah state. They got to go. And I'm glad that we're doing something about it. It's bad news if you're Tucker Carlson or some kind of like other opportunist who decided that being opposed to kind of hawkish policy was a key plank in making yourself appeal to a diverse constituency of, I don't know, Trump voters. So pure war is this kind of complex piece of the Trump administration. Is he a kind of candidate for militarization, for getting into a hot war with another country or not? But there's also this impure war going on where the enemy is inside society and also has to be surveilled or detained or deported or violently expunged. So maybe if you're in this kind of camp of conservatives, you don't think that we should bomb Iran. So that's the Tucker Carlson type. But you do think that like trans people are doing terrorism against your gender or something bizarre, or you think that migrants are replacing you in a kind of demographic invasion. So the Trump administration is balancing both this kind of pure war constituency inside of itself and an impure war constituency inside of itself. It's trying to collect that diverse set of weird people. But the thing that kind of underpins all that diversity and all those contradictions is a commitment to do violence, whether it's external or internal. And that is like the unifying piece that Virilio wants to figure out. Like, what is the violence at the heart of militarized society, whether it's directed outward or inward? What is that violence and how do we do something different? And that is like such a complicated and important kind of question to figure out.
Yeah. That's a great a great take. I'm into this idea. The thing that I always find interesting about pure war and about the idea of underlying violence, right? It's like society is mobilized in a way where all of this violence is going to get done. But there's this weird like flip, because on the one hand, it is all undergirded by violence, 100%. But on the other hand, there's a type of like domestication that underlies pure war as well, where it's like pure war is about disciplining people who kind of fall outside the lines, but it's also about creating sort of like a home for a handful of people to feel very comfortable in. People who think that trans people are like, you know, doing terrorism against their gender, whatever. Terrorism against their gender is such a funny phrase. I like I like that a lot. But anyways, that's I guess an interesting thing about the violence that Virilio is describing is that not only is it sort of like a real attack against all of these sort of like internal quote unquote problems within society. I wouldn't say that, but that's what the right would say. But it's like it's like hollowing out a space or making a place that's comfortable for all these other people. So this sort of weird domestication on the one hand, building a comfortable place for people to live, and then violence. Violence is the way to get it done. And I mean, it's also the case too that the people who are who would be comfortably living in this society where, I don't know, trans people didn't exist or immigrants were deported, they're also experiencing violence, but maybe not in the same way. So yeah, I don't know, a lot of interesting ideas going on there, but I think it's helpful to like draw out the ways that the violence is sort of like inherent in the everyday lived experience of this society, that the war has no real beginning and no real end. It's just sort of like an ongoing way of life.
Right. And I think that is the most troubling piece, right? Maybe to pull in even one more piece here. Virilio has this great book of interviews called The Administration of Fear. And it's one of the last books that is published in English, at least. And in it he kind of talks through like what it means to live in a society that's characterized by all that, by that kind of pure and impure war situation. He says fear is now an environment, a surrounding, a world. It occupies and preoccupies us. Fear was once a phenomenon related to localized, identifiable threats that were limited to a certain time frame: wars, famines, epidemics. Today, the world itself is limited, saturated, reduced, restricting us to stressful claustrophobia, contagious stock crises, faceless terrorism, lightning pandemics. Fear is a world, panic as a whole. The administration of fear also means that states are tempted to create policies for the orchestration and management of fear. Globalization has progressively eaten away at the traditional prerogatives of the state, most notably the welfare state, and they have to convince citizens that they can ensure their physical safety. A dual health and security ideology has been established, and it represents a real threat to democracy.
Right.
And to me, like, that is such a when you read that and you think about, like, the MAGA and the MAHA, like the RFK Jr. Donald Trump alliance, you're like, oh man, that is like exactly what's going on, right? Like, we're living in a kind of situation where the entire environment is just permeated by fear. And what the kind of right wing does in particular is to seize on that environment and say, we're here to keep you safe. And people buy that, even if it doesn't keep them safe or fragilizes them in other ways. And especially that kind of like health and security ideology coming together, I think is really significant. And, like when you build a whole society premised on violence being the means to sort things out, whether it's like bombing a country far away or putting a bunch of people in cages internally, you're essentially creating the conditions of fear that you then I guess, used to make a case for the legitimacy of the state. That there's this kind of like background fear to everything. And man, I mean, all you have to do is like look at your own social media feed to like suddenly get a sense of that feeling and then be like, man, what am I supposed to do with that for the rest of my day?
Yeah, no kidding. This is such an extreme example, and this is like also an example that I'm bringing up increasingly more often on this podcast. But Alex Jones is insane. If you don't know who he is, he's like a conspiracy theorist with a radio show. He's famous for spreading a conspiracy theory about the the parents of the Sandy Hook kids who were murdered in a school shooting, that they were crisis actors and that the whole thing was sort of staged. He would contest that. And in fact, he has had to legally contest that because he's been sued by the parents of those kids. Alex Jones is nuts. But he, despite legal cases, despite everything going on with Alex Jones, he still has a radio show, and every single day he does a radio show for more than 1 hour, several hours, where he will basically like tell you the scariest things that he can make up in his mind about like the globalists who are coming to like kill you and your parents and your dog. But something that's really interesting about the show that I'm like trying, I need to do like sort of more investigation into this, but since this is a podcast, I don't really have any accountability. I can just sort of say whatever I want about this thing. So like he'll go from like, telling you the scariest thing about whatever the world. And then he'll switch really quick. He'll be like, okay, but to support my show, you can go to this online store, which is for legal reasons owned by Alex Jones' dad. And you can buy like all kinds of medical supplements, maybe not medical supplements, maybe that's the wrong word, like medicinal supplements, like fake snake oil that you would buy or whatever. But the one that he's like really been hawking lately is this thing called methylene blue, and he says that it's great because it's what RFK Jr. takes. And it's like this weird, it's like a salt, but it's blue. It's like really bright, like a dark blue color. And I think it's used for something like treating like cyanide poisoning or something crazy like that, right? But in the show, it's always really funny because he's like, okay, but don't worry, we sell the tablets, not just like the liquid, so it doesn't stain your mouth blue. So you can buy this like wild fake medicine from Alex Jones that will get the toxins out of your body or whatever, and it doesn't turn your mouth blue. But it is like, the whole reason I'm telling this story is, well, first of all, it's very funny, but second, because it is like it is the balance of exactly these two things, right? It's the balance of like terror on the one hand, security, like the striving towards like a strong militaristic state where that can like crush its enemies, which is I think that Alex Jones likes to talk about, but also like the sense of like having to really curate your own bodily health through all kinds of weird and alternative means, I guess.
Man, that reminds me. This is also a side note. I guess that's just the vibe of this episode, but it reminds me of this HBO docuseries called "Love Has Won." Did you see that?
Oh
About this
yeah,
cult woman who, oh man, I forget what she ate, silver iodine or
colloidal
something.
silver. Yeah,
Anyway, that's it.
yeah.
She turned blue, and that was very yucky and scary. But
Alex Jones has also
that's gonna
sold
happen to Alex
colloidal
Jones.
silver on the show in the past too, so that's cool. Alternative medicine's
That's
a
wild.
wild thing, man. I don't know enough about medicine to really be a qualified person to call something alternative, but I know that there's like some weird stuff out there, and that's probably one of them.
Yeah, I'd say so. But I think that kind of logic, right? The like, well, Virilio often will pull this out to say that the right wing has kind of, and not only the right, the left too, neoliberalism more broadly. He will use that term. It has created, on the one hand, what seems like a minimal state. The state shouldn't basically give you anything. The state shouldn't provide public services. It shouldn't make sure that you have food stamps or that you can eat or that your kids can go to school or that the environment is safe. The state really shouldn't do any of that stuff. At best, what the state should do is create a smooth territory for capitalists to make money. That's kind of the idea. That's neoliberalism. But the irony for Virilio is that like the the minimal state is actually pretty gigantic when it comes to military spending, when it comes to the ability to like blow people up and murder them and so on. That's like a place where the state can't seem to even stop growing. And these two things for Virilio are not contradictions, but they're like two sides of the same coin. That the more you kind of pull away from the security, the actual security of society, which is to say, like meeting people's real life needs, the more you inevitably invest into this kind of like false solution of murderous security. And I think you see that so evidently with someone like Donald Trump and Trump supporters, where the whole point is that he's not a politician. He's a businessman. He's going to run the country like a business. We're going to, like erase the state as much as possible. We're going to get Elon in here. He's going to doge everything to death. It's all going to go. And at the same time, like it's the most draconian immigration policy that you've ever seen. It's a state that is constantly bragging about how many like nuclear submarines it has roving around in the ocean. It is ready to tell you that like at any moment we could snap our fingers and you'll be gone. And that's like the kind of two sides of the same coin logic Virilio wants to pull out, that the securitized state is the kind of direct consequence of the erosion of the state for the purposes of capital. And maybe what is particularly relevant about that, I think, is when you're a Marxist and you're looking at the state and neoliberalism, you kind of like, you look at it from an economic perspective. You're like, why is the state doing this? How does it facilitate the exploitation of labor, the extraction of value from people and places, all that kind of stuff? And I think that is essential. We shouldn't stop doing that. But what Virilio wants to do is to ask that kind of second question of like, what is the drive to militarization? It is imperialism on the one hand, but it's also this like more this more ontological state of anxiety. It's like this like deeper foundation of anxiety that Virilio thinks has always permeated kind of how humans try to organize themselves. I mean, Virilio is like also not a severe pessimist. Like he's a Christian. He doesn't think that like, humans are just naturally like the only possibility for human life was that we would invent a gigantic war machine. But he does think that that's what we did for a variety of reasons. And I think what's really fascinating trying to think through like how the Trump regime is acting in the world is to kind of understand that there is this military logic underneath it, that capital is a huge part of it. They go hand in hand. They can't be separated, but we need to kind of understand the logic of the military on its own terms if we want to also figure out, what's going on and how to resist all that.
So much of this militarization has a lot to do with sort of the ways that technology is kind of pumped out into the world and the ways that Virilio sees our culture is sort of being downstream from that technology, which I think is true in a lot of ways. I mean, I don't know. I don't know exactly where people are coming into this podcast at, but sometimes you'll hear people say things like, I don't know, technology is neutral and it's just kind of up to people to decide how they want to use it or something. And that is very much not what Paul Virilio thinks, and I think is actually pretty helpful intervention into technology, especially when it comes to militarization. Paul Virilio thinks that it's through the expansion of sort of like military means that we get basically every type of technology, and I mean basically every in a very expansive sense. Like, for example, Paul Virilio has a book where he's talking about the ways like that a revolver like a gun that you would use is like the precursor to a film camera, and like how these are sort of linked in a deep media history. And I think that's actually, I mean, that's a bizarre example, a wild bit of like trivia that you can you can drum up at the next trivia night at the pub or whatever. But like, it's a helpful example of the ways that Paul Virilio is thinking, and exactly how we kind of get ourselves into this mess where like we, technology, whatever it might be, a camera or whatever, has its roots in sort of a military background, in a background that's like obsessed with violence, and then all these things kind of cascade down into human culture, and we become these like people who are shaped and live within society, like live within architectures and societies that are based on military logics. And it's just a lot when you start thinking about it. But maybe we can turn the corner for a hot second. We've talked so much at this point about war and how it's sort of all encompassing, and we live in a society based on violence and all this kind of great stuff. But Paul Virilio, while he doesn't have like a political program that he's like willing to give you, there's no pamphlet that this guy will ever hand you that has like here's what you do next. But interestingly enough, Paul Virilio does have a particular type of ethics that is in his work that is, I think, definitely based on his Christian faith. And it's one that he always describes as being pacifist. He's a pacifist. But there's like a lot of interesting things and a lot of interesting nuance that comes with Paul Virilio and pacifism. And man, when I first was reading Paul Virilio, this was an idea that like really turned me off to him. I think because in my, I guess, earlier Christian days, I was really interested in the sort of like post-liberal pacifist positions of like Stanley Hauerwas or John Howard Yoder or whatever, which are fine if that's like really your thing. But I felt that they were always sort of lacking or problematic, especially when you start thinking of big ideas like class war and imperialism and, struggles for liberation. But I think that Paul Virilio has a whole sort of different perspective on pacifism that's making me really come back around to the idea. And I think that there's something actually really important about pacifism that people like in very sort of like literal like post-liberal circles probably miss. Like, for example, in sorry, this is like a tangent on a tangent, but John Howard Yoder is a Mennonite sort of theologian, right? And he has a big book called The Politics of Jesus, and he has all these reasons about why, based on sort of a type of biblical theology, that like pacifism is like the appropriate ethics and politics for Christians. And like what that means is like, being against the war for sure. The war in sort of a general term, any war. I think John Howard Yoder would be against it. But, it's also about like, if somebody breaks into your house in the middle of the night, it means that you can't kill them or something. Like, it kind of comes down to this sort of like absurdist level that I think ends up being really problematic for people. But Paul Virilio has a sort of different take on pacifism where it's not really about like a personal ethic or something, but it's about finding ways to change the structures of society so that like maybe the war is over. There could be a discernible end to the war or an outside to fighting or violence or something. I don't know, Dean. Sorry, I've said a lot of very personal biographical details about myself now about pacifism. Are there any that you also want to throw in there, or do you feel good about skipping over them?
Let's see. Well, John Howard Yoder is the sex pest. I think that's important to say
So
on
important.
air.
Cannot say John Howard without that part. So important. Yes, please.
Not cool. I'm against it. I think that was a bad idea for him to do. But yeah, I mean, I had a similar trajectory in that sense, and maybe that also like leaves a bad taste in your mouth for certain kinds of pacifism. But at the same time, I can't like quit trying to engage certain other forms of pacifism that are not so silly. I think one of the big problems with that kind of post-liberal form of pacifism is, in part, as you say, it kind of gets reduced to these like, I guess, like thought experiments that
Yeah,
I
yeah.
think are probably also not necessarily only theoretical. Like I've met lots of pacifists in that kind of camp who I firmly believe would be like truly committed to a creative nonviolent solution if push came to shove, and in fact have done so. Like I've heard lots of stories of people doing so. So I don't think that it's just like totally utopian or idealist or bad. I think there's kind of a heroism to it that is really neat. At the same time, though, I do think that it is like kind of too naive, in part also because it's kind of a Christianity of like retreat in a certain way, right? It's like pulling you back into a Christian formation. It's like politics is basically going to church and kind of figuring out what church says, and then going out into the world and doing that whole thing. And I think that is insufficient for how complicated the world is. And, you know, one criticism that sometimes comes up about that, which I think is right, is like if you follow that kind of ethic, you could probably carve out a pretty unique island of peace that would be genuinely beautiful, actually radical, very cool, a good thing in the world. And more people, you know, if everybody did it, it would be great. But an island of peace is like not sufficient to deal with like an ocean of violence. And I think that is kind of the big question is, you know, how much do we really commit ourselves to undoing the systems of violence that someone like Virilio is trying to parse out. And I think that's the piece that people like Yoder or Hauerwas kind of can't get you to, because it stops too early. Like the analysis of violence and war doesn't get deep enough.
Yeah, I think that is great. That makes a lot of sense. Yeah, I mean, and nothing against people who are like committed to that ethic. That's great. That's good for you. But like, I always think about how weird it is to do like the weird pacifist thought experiments about like, well, what would you do in this like one situation when it's like, I don't know, we do live in a society that is undergirded by violence. Like, why don't we think about that situation? It's a real thought experiment. Yep. Paul Virilio talks about pacifism a few times in this book that I think is pretty interesting. That kind of gets deeper at the point that we're talking about here. I'll go ahead and read these two chunks about it, and we can talk about some of what it means. So this is from the book Pure War, and Virilio says the word pacifist has meaning which I adopt insofar as it's linked to my faith, an official faith confronting another faith. Yep. You know that I'm a Christian, and as a Christian, I reject the nuclear faith. This is the other faith that he's talking about, the nuclear faith in deterrence, in war and violence and all this kind of stuff. So I'm a Christian, and as a Christian, I reject the nuclear faith because I believe in the peace of Christ. The believer in God protests against the divinity of the ultimate weapon. There they can talk of peace. They can call themselves pacifists in the name of a belief which opposes another, idolatrous belief, the missile, no longer the Messiah. I think this is a really interesting like intervention into the conversation of pacifism, because there is a type of person out in the world who like would suggest that, well, you know, there, I mean, somebody like Donald Trump, honestly, the other day he was tweeting about, you know, bombing and winning peace. But there's like a real person out there in the world, like that has a real politic that's just like, well, to really secure peace, if you really want to like work towards a peace and just society, you need a strong military to kill the bad guys, right? And that's a type of like that's a type of pacifism. That's a belief in deterrence above all else. That the thing that will really secure peace in the world is like, you know, is a nuclear bomb on one side and a nuclear bomb on the other side, and then there's sort of a frozen group of people in the middle who are like basically hostages to the state. Very interesting that that observation is one that Virilio makes, and then he ends up saying that, like, well, the state is actually just a big terrorist if you think about it, because they're like holding everybody hostage. Nobody can do anything. If whatever, somebody gets out of line, then boom, it's all over. Not just for the bad guys, but for the quote unquote good guys as well. So, anyways, I think this is a cool confrontation between Christianity, something that is invested in peace, and a different type of faith, the nuclear faith. I like this sort of framing. I think it's pretty neat.
Yeah. I mean, he goes on to say also in the interview a little bit later. This is from the book called Pure War, by the way. I don't think we even said that in the whole episode. Anyway, that's what it's from. He says the pacifists of the 1930s opposed real war. Wait, did you read this part already?
No, I didn't.
Okay, great. I'm gonna keep reading it then. For whatever reason, maybe you read it to me earlier, and there was some weird deja vu triggered in my brain. The pacifists of the 1930s opposed real war, a war inscribed in its practical execution. Pacifists today oppose the tendency toward war. In other words, the war for preparation for war. Not a hypothetical war, which could begin in France, China, or elsewhere, but war as scientific and technological preparation. And then the interviewer says they oppose peace as war. And Virilio confirms that, saying they oppose peace as war, as infinite preparation which exhausts and will eventually eliminate societies. And then, in an extreme Virilio move, he says, in any case, the apocalypse is here. It could happen at any moment. But the interesting argument is that apocalypse is hidden in development itself, in the development of arms, that is, in the non-development of society. And that's the piece that I think Virilio wants to really drive home, that, like, a true pacifist position is one that is trying to figure out, like, the military, infrastructure on which we all live, on which we've kind of built our cities. And the idea, too, that the development of arms is kind of tied to the non-development of society, I think is such an important kind of thing to note. I mean, even just materially speaking, we dump so much money and resources and non-renewable resources into, like, flying around jets and hoping that they could kill somebody if they had to and all that kind of stuff, which is like every dollar that's spent on a fighter jet is a dollar that's not spent on, like, making sure a kid can go to school or people can go to the doctor or whatever. It's a kind of anti-development or anti-peace process, not only in terms of being something for war, but it's like pulling out the resources we need to have a peaceful society. And I think, like, the idea that violence is just like two bodies encountering each other in space, and to be a pacifist, you would just, like, refuse to, retaliate if one of those bodies hit you or something like that, or you would, like, creatively try to solve that without hitting back. I think that is, like, fine to think about for sure. People should think about that. But Virilio wants to say violence is a lot deeper than that. It's like, violence is all the stuff that kind of happened before these two bodies ever ended up in the same place, such that, like, one of them wanted to hit another one. And I think that is such a key piece. Like, I'm not really sold personally on, I don't know, the term nonviolence or pacifism. I'm not a particularly violent person. I would not be good at doing violence. I have no desire to do it. So maybe that just, like, defaults me into being a functional pacifist. Theoretically, I think that there are, like, legitimate armed struggles in history and so on. But I do think that Virilio kind of rescues the term of pacifism in a way that I'm like, okay, maybe that's how I want to be a pacifist, right? Like, trying to undo all the structures of violence that undergird my life.
Yeah, I think it's a pretty challenging idea to bring to the table, because it does give you something to do. Like, it's not programmatic in, a 3 easy steps towards something way, but it does give you something to do in the sense that, like, well, how would you start, like, demilitarizing the society that you live in, or how would you start, like, reorienting towards the development of society rather than the non-development of society or something? I think those are great questions that you can ask, like, in all kinds of different political contexts and milieus, whether it's local politics or national politics or whatever. I think that there's just, like, when the problem is so all encompassing, the work is, like, never ending and kind of always in your face.
Yeah, and I also think that there's lots of people doing that in an important way too. That it's always in your face, but not in such a way that means you can't do anything. Like I think about like World Beyond War, for example, which has been out there constantly organizing stuff against military like arms factories and kind of really organizing at the point of production of destruction, if you will, which I think is really great. I think even to a certain extent, the kind of like plowshares movement, which we've talked about on the show in the past, kind of fits into this sort of, invading a military base, pouring blood all over a weapon, and just refusing to be fine with that. I think those kind of direct confrontations with war in a really obvious way are important. But I also think of things like abolition and like the confrontation with prisons and the sort of drive to imagine a world without police. Like all these things are also part of that same struggle of trying to like build a world that doesn't tend toward those anxieties that cause people to want to invest in military means of some form or other. And I think that's a pacifism I can get behind for Virilio. How do we kind of understand the interlocking systems that make a violent world? And maybe that's the kind of pacifism that we need.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, I want to turn towards like one more quote that I think is actually interesting. Um, and let me give a bit of context to what it is, and then we can talk about maybe what it means. So there's a part in this book, Pure War, where the interviewer and Paul Virilio are talking about like the actually existing peace movements as they exist in the world. So they talk about the peace movement. This is a book that's written in the 80s, by the way. So they're talking about the peace movement as it exists in Germany and France and sort of throughout Europe. And the conclusion is that they come to is it's sort of like plagued by a type of humanitarian thinking, sort of like a liberal type of thinking that's really just it's not on the scale of like actually understanding the problem as Paul Virilio sees it. And they also have sort of a back and forth about how interesting the American anti-war movement is, and citing a church and a Catholic parish who was like resisting paying federal taxes, which is very cool. Paul Virilio says, "Great job." He actually interesting. Sorry, this is an aside, but Paul Virilio, he goes out of his way to be like, yeah, if any place should have an anti-war movement or a pacifist movement, it should be the United States, because it's like a place where people are like in the middle of it and they will know how the war machine works better than anyone else. And I don't think that's necessarily true, but I appreciate his optimism. um, so anyways, now on to the actual point of this whole thing, the quote. So the interviewer is talking to Paul Virilio, and he's like, okay, well, if these peace movements that exist are sort of like outmoded by militarism, like what is it that we should start building on to sort of get our heads on straight? Like what do we need to think about to really start like considering yeah, militarism, and maybe how to do some of that work of like, I don't know, the development of society away from militarism. Okay. And Paul Virilio says, such a French philosopher kind of thing to do. What you should do is you should think about death. Paul Virilio writes, they should try to revive the question of death, because let's not forget that the gravest danger in a post-monarchic society is the concealment of death. In ancient societies, particularly the Greek, the question of death was central. Menander said that for mortals, consciousness is God. We idealize and idolize consciousness because we are mortal. I tend to think that we invest in consciousness and reason in history because we're mortal. A statement like that suggests that if we weren't mortal, there would be no consciousness. If we were conscious, it's because we are immortal. Death and consciousness are allied. Thus, the consciousness of death is the origin of consciousness. There's a lot going on here, but I think it's good, and let me tell you why. So for for Paul Virilio, sort of central to this militarized society is the use of like a particular. It's about a comportment towards towards technology that is sort of getting away from us. Dean read a quote at the very beginning of this episode about history progresses at the speed of its weapon systems, and this idea of speed is a really integral idea to Paul Virilio. And because technology sort of trends towards this direction of instantaneous communication and sort of instantaneous presence, whether that means like telecommunications or the internet, you can Snapchat anyone wherever you are in the world, or it means like a bomb could drop on your head basically at any second. Like speed is of the essence. Speed is like the defining feature of so many military technologies, right? And um, basically, Paul Virilio is trying to draw out the idea that like because speed introduces like an instantaneous effect in the world, it hides so many things because it happens so fast. Because there's like a type of unthinking that we come to to technology with because of how fast things happen. A sort of like mystification that we just live with. That's part of our everyday life. So like I don't know, the war in Iran right now is such a great example of that because it happened like in a split second. There's this like kind of incredible video of Bernie Sanders speaking at a rally, and then somebody from the audience yells at him like, "We just bombed Iran," and he like looks flabbergasted and does not know what to do until somebody runs out on stage, like one of his staffers, and like gives him a piece of paper that's like, "Hey, this just happened," and I think like that's such a great example of the ways that we don't think about death because it happens so quickly. We can't consider the reality of the situation. We can't consider like what's actually happening because of the ways that technology and speed are co-opted towards militarization, towards violence, towards death, and all these kinds of things. So Paul Virilio is saying like we should try to revive the question of death. We should rethink about what death is and the ways that like um it's triggered, it happens, and how our consciousness is tied up with it. Like is not like a overly philosophical question. It's not just sort of like a romantic thing that he's suggesting. He's saying it because like we literally can't think about death. We don't have time. It happens too quickly. It happens like far away in this like weird instantaneous way. So thinking about death ends up becoming sort of a really radical act, and that's rad. I think that's a really interesting thing to start thinking about. All of the ways that you can't see it happen, but it's happening or something. Um, yeah. Dean, what are your thoughts about thinking about death?
I mean, I think like every episode now, it just returns us to the scene of the Bone
It's
Church.
the Bone Church all the way down, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly. This is an argument for bone perversion. It's an argument for the memento mori, and I'm here for it. I think, to be honest, this is like a classic existentialist thing, right? When you're conscious of your death, you can sort of begin to really think about your life, and not only existentialism, but all the way back to Socrates. This is like the fundamental promise of philosophy that it's a preparation to die. And I think that there is probably something too unnecessarily intense about that. It's like a bit too masculine. There's lots of good feminist critiques of it. Also, looking at other limit scenarios in life, like why can't your birth or your origins or your connection with others be the beginning of consciousness? Why does it have to be like the most isolating moment of your life of death to kind of contemplate and then receive consciousness? I think those are all good and fair critiques, and they're great. I think though there's a lot of utility in what Virilio's saying if we can kind of like put it through those filters. So instead of being like, well, Virilio is just still right, or this tradition of like death is still right, and we don't have to read all that other stuff. I think instead it's kind of being like, well, having like passed through all that and maybe like shedding some of the heroism of like confronting your own death and all that kind of thing, there's something to the reality that at the end of the day, when we talk about war and violence, we are talking about situations of life and death. And when you really grapple with the reality of death, like the Bone Church is trying to get you to do, or like Virilio is trying to get you to do, then it sort of pulls you out of the abstraction or the virtuality of the world that we live in today, right? Like mediated by screens, scrolling your phone, looking at like how many civilians have been killed, all this kind of stuff. Like it's sort of easy to, I guess, just end up being mediatized out of real life, and death is that thing that like returns you to real life. Like I think a lot about that plaque at the the Bone Church,
Yeah.
unsurprisingly, saying what you are we once were, and what we are you will be. And it does put things in perspective, right? To be like, man, my time's pretty limited actually, and one day I'm just gonna be bones, just like these bones. And what does that commit you to? What does it make kind of meaningful or meaningless? And there's something to the great equalizer of death that really is probably right to pull out.
Yeah, I think so too. Figuring out like the ways that it's erased from our eyes, right? That we are living in a world that's sort of like sanitized is such a big deal. To be fair to Virilio, and you know I love to be fair to him. He also does talk about like what does it mean to sort of build a politics of life after the fact as well. Like, okay, we're thinking about death, and then what does it mean to think about death and then also to think about living? And he does have this kind of interesting but like confusing thing that he says where he's like, well, life, people think about it as just duration. Like, you're alive, you're like sort of doing a biological process for a certain amount of time and then you stop. But it's not just about sort of duration or how long you're alive or a biological function, but it's about the intensity with which you're living life. And that's a really interesting, I think, idea to sort of introduce into the conversation about death as well, right? About intensity and like what does it mean to live an intense life. And Rilio gives like I think actually not a very good example where it's like, well, you could live 60 years and just be alive for those 60 years, but like that's not living an intensely like good life or something. That's just being alive for a duration. But I think that is, I don't know, it's something that you can only start thinking about though when you realize you're going to die someday. There needs to be sort of an intensity to it. Hopefully a helpful idea, but I think it is hard to get away. Like like you said a minute ago, the considering your own death is like sort of an existentialist thing, but the way that Virilio is doing it, I think is a really Catholic way of thinking about the world. The memento mori, it's like recognizing sister bodily death or something in St. Francis's, Canticle of Creation. It's just recognizing that it's not something that you can escape and you're living your life kind of in the shadow of that, not in like a spooky way necessarily, but sort of in a more fragile way than you would have maybe otherwise.
Yeah, I mean, I guess in light of Iran and all the rest of it, that's the thing that you would hope that would happen to Donald Trump. That he does seem like a person who's basically impervious to the realization that one day he won't be here. And not only Trump, I mean, that's the problem of kind of the, absurdly, like, badly geriatric leadership of the Democratic Party. Nothing against old people, but come on, it's out of control. And it's this kind of like denial of death in a real way that, if you really reckoned with the fact that one day you won't be here, then maybe you wouldn't be so evil and dumb and bad. Maybe you do something different. He needs like the ghost of Christmas future to come and point at his grave or something, and then Donald Trump can go to the White House window and ask for cooked goose and just be chill. But I think that is true, right? Like there's a kind of fake world, a virtual world where you just make America great again for all of eternity, but one day you won't. And none of us will be here. And there's something kind of like terrifying, but also liberating and beautiful about that situation. And Virilio's kind of pacifism based on death, I think, is the kind of thing that can maybe, motivate you to also undo the systems of like unnecessary death, even if you know that you've got to deal with it someday.
Okay, Dean, everything you said was great. Incredibly insightful, philosophically good, heartfelt, and wonderful. But can we stop the podcast for one fucking second? Donald Trump just did a tweet that says, "Congratulations, everyone! It's been fully agreed between Israel and Iran that there will be a complete and total ceasefire."
We did it.
We did it. Man, we sent these vibes out into the world. Donald Trump considered death for a second, and now he's like, "Wow, we have to end this war."
That's probably exactly what happened. He choked on another chicken tender, and here we are. We did it. Thanks for listening to the Magnificast. If you like what you heard, and if you liked the peace deal that we did accomplish just now between Iran and Israel, you can support us on Patreon at patreon.com/the Magnificast. If you do that, you can also get into our Discord, and people are talking about all kinds of stuff. Some recent frustrations with the pagination of the new Marx translation of Capital. You can you can get in there and talk about that if you want. What else is going on here? Let's see. I shared a link to a big sale at Orbis Books, so you can buy cheap liberation theology books. You probably didn't know that unless you were in this Discord, I guess. I don't know. I'm not really selling it, but I feel like we've been podcasting too long, and that's kind of it. You know the drill. Everybody there is nice and good and fun and smart.
The
so
war that we've literally just been talking about for an hour is over. Like, what else can anyone want?
That's right. Our music is by Amaria Armstrong, and our outro is by The Illogical Spoon, and we'll see you next week.
I don't wanna get up for church in the morning, souls alive. Heaven come to earth and there won't be no church. We'll meet down by the riverside. There we'll swim with all creation. Never get tired, never bored. Don't worry, someday there'll be no dam between us and our Lord. Jackson, you keep your hoods up. Keep your hoods up and you stay up late. In Jackson, you keep your hoods up. Well, you keep your hoods up and you stay up late. Oh, don't mind a cold night, but we might mind if you leave too soon. So come on now, it's still early. Beside what else are you gonna do? As we kissed in the alley by the Michigan Theater, fall snow was glowing in the lights of the downtown. Saw a spark in your eyes, I just spoke it. Said we're gonna turn this whole place upside down. Then you said, my dear, do you really mean this? I said, I only know what I feel right now. I said, poets like